What if two sisters on a plantation shared more than power, and their secret changed everything when it could no longer be hidden? Welcome to Story of the Black Past, a place where we uncover powerful and often hidden truths from history. Stories of control, silence, and the consequences of decisions made behind closed doors. If you are new here, tell us in the comments where you are watching from, your city, your country, and the time you are watching this video. We always love to see how far our stories travel. If you have not yet subscribed, please subscribe and like this video. Your support helps us continue bringing these important stories to light. Thank you for being here. Now relax, avoid all distractions, and pay close attention. Watch until the very end, because what you are about to hear is something history rarely speaks about openly. Tonight we travel to rural Alabama in the mid-19th century, a place where power was inherited, controlled, and rarely questioned. This is the story of two sisters who lived within that power, and a secret that began quietly, but could not remain hidden. They were known for their closeness, not just as siblings, but as partners in everything. They managed the household together, made decisions together, moved as if they shared the same mind, and at first, nothing about that seemed unusual, because unity in that world was seen as strength. But over time, something began to shift, not publicly, not in a way that could be easily seen, but within the structure of the household itself. There was a man, enslaved, quiet, observant, present within the daily operations of the plantation. At first, his role was simple: work, obedience, routine. But slowly, his position changed, not in title, not in visibility, but in proximity. He was called more often, placed closer to the household, trusted in ways that others were not. And that is where the first signs appeared. Not clear, not defined, but noticeable, because patterns began to form, and patterns, when repeated, reveal something deeper. The sisters remained composed, unchanged in public, but within the house something had shifted, a connection, a shared decision, something that existed between them that no one else fully understood. The others noticed. Of course they did, but they did not speak, because speaking was not safe, and silence in that place was protection. Time passed, and what had once been hidden began to surface, not through confession, but through consequence, because some things cannot remain unseen forever. The balance within the household began to change, not loudly, but noticeably, because when something hidden begins to affect what is visible, it can no longer be contained. As this story begins to unfold further, one truth becomes clear. This was never just about a secret. It was about power, about control, about decisions made within a system that allowed them, and the consequences that followed when those decisions could no longer remain hidden. And once that moment arrives, everything begins to change. The change did not arrive all at once on that plantation in Alabama. It revealed itself slowly, in ways that could be felt before they were fully understood, because what had once been contained within the house was beginning to affect everything around it. The sisters remained outwardly unchanged, still composed, still united, still moving as one. But beneath that, something had shifted, something that could no longer remain entirely hidden. The man at the center of it all did not change his behavior, not openly. He continued his work, followed instructions, moved as expected, but his presence now carried weight, a kind of attention that had not existed before, because people began to notice, not clearly, not directly, but enough to sense that something within the structure of the household was no longer stable. The first signs appeared in small ways: altered routines, unspoken tensions, moments where silence lingered longer than it should, and those moments began to connect, forming a pattern that could not be ignored forever. The women in the house understood before anyone else. not because they were told, but because they observed, because they lived within the rhythm of the house. And when that rhythm changed, they felt it immediately. They spoke less, moved more carefully, watched more closely, because they knew something was unfolding, something that would not remain contained. Time passed, and the hidden became visible, not through words, but through reality. Because some consequences do not need explanation, they reveal themselves, and once they do, everything changes. The balance between the sisters shifted, not completely, but enough, because what had once been shared equally was now complicated by something neither of them could fully control, and that created tension. Not loud, not explosive, but present. A quiet strain beneath their unity. The plantation itself felt it, because when something changes at the center, everything around it adjusts, even if no one speaks about it. The man remained, still within the system, still without power in the way others defined it, and yet, somehow, at the center of something that had disrupted that system. And that contradiction made everything more complex, because it revealed something uncomfortable, that even within structures built on control, there are moments where control becomes uncertain. This was not just about what happened, it was about what it exposed. That power, when used without limit, creates consequences it cannot always contain. That control, when stretched beyond its boundaries, begins to shift. And once that shift begins, it cannot be reversed. Not completely, not quietly, because something has already been revealed. Something that cannot be unseen. That is where this story rests, not in the event itself, but in what followed. A quiet disruption, a lasting tension, and a reminder that even the most controlled systems carry within them the possibility of change. And once that possibility becomes real, everything is different. And even as time continued across that plantation in Alabama, what had been set in motion did not fade. It settled into everything. Because once something hidden becomes visible, even without words, it changes how everything is understood. The sisters were no longer exactly as they had been, not outwardly, not in a way others could easily point to, but internally. Something had shifted between them, a quiet tension, not spoken, but present, because what had once been shared without complication now carried weight, something neither of them could fully ignore. The household felt it, in the way conversations shortened, in the way movements became more deliberate, in the way silence began to hold more meaning than words, because silence in that space was no longer empty. It was full of awareness. The man remained where he had always been, within the system, without formal power, and yet connected to something that had altered the structure around him, and that contradiction remained, unresolved, because it revealed something the system was not built to acknowledge. That control is not always complete, that outcomes cannot always be predicted, that consequences do not always follow the rules set for them. The plantation owner, if distant or absent before, could no longer ignore what had surfaced, not necessarily in detail, but in effect, because effects cannot be hidden once they begin to shape reality, and reality, once changed, does not return to what it was. What happened within that house was not just a secret revealed. It was a boundary crossed, a moment where power created something it could not fully contain, and once that happens, everything shifts, not loudly, not all at once, but permanently, because the system continues, the structure remains, but the certainty within it is no longer complete. That is where this story rests, not in the details, not in the moment itself, but in what it revealed, a quiet disruption, a lasting awareness, and a reminder that even within the most controlled environments, there are outcomes that cannot be fully managed, and once they appear, and even now, after everything has settled into silence, there is still something that remains. Because what unfolded in that house in Alabama was never only about the moment itself. It was about what lingered after, what stayed, what quietly reshaped everything without needing to be spoken. The sisters continued. The household continued. The plantation itself moved forward as if nothing had changed. But something had. Not visibly, not in structure, but in understanding. Because once a boundary is crossed, it cannot be uncrossed. Once something is revealed, even without words, it cannot return to being unseen. And that is what remained. A quiet awareness, one that lived beneath everything else, in the way the sisters looked at one another, in the way the household moved around them, in the way silence carried more meaning than it ever had before. Because silence, once filled with truth, does not empty again. It holds, it preserves, it reminds. The man at the center of it all continued his life within the same system, but he was no longer just part of it. He had become part of something that had shifted it, even if only slightly, even if only within that space. And that is what made it lasting. Because change does not always need to be large to be permanent. Sometimes it exists in the smallest shift, the quietest realization, the moment where something no longer fits the way it once did, only something to carry with you. That power does not always produce the outcomes it expects. That control is not always complete. That even within systems designed to define everything, there are moments that cannot be contained within those definitions. And once those moments occur, they do not disappear. They remain in awareness, in perception, in the quiet understanding that something has changed, not in the past alone, but in that awareness, through time, through thought. Through every moment we recognize that not everything can be controlled, and once that is understood, everything is different. And even now, beyond every ending, there is still something that does not settle, because what unfolded in that house in Alabama was never meant to be fully resolved. It was meant to remain, not as something easily explained, but as an awareness, a quiet understanding that something once happened that could not be undone. And that awareness does not fade, it stays, in the way people think, in the way they recognize when something feels just slightly out of place, in the way certainty no longer feels complete. The sisters were never the same again. Not visibly, not in a way that could be easily described, but internally. Because once something changes within a shared understanding, it alters everything that comes after. The household carried that shift, not through conversation, but through behavior, through silence, through the subtle ways people moved differently around what they now knew. Because knowledge does not need to be spoken to exist. It only needs to be recognized. And once recognized, it becomes part of everything. The man remained within the system, but no longer entirely defined by it, because he had become part of a moment that revealed something the system could not fully contain. And that is what made it lasting. Not the event, but the realization. That control has limits, that outcomes cannot always be predicted, that even within rigid structures, something unexpected can emerge, only something to recognize, that not all stories end with clarity. Some end with awareness, with the understanding that something existed beyond what could be explained. And that understanding does not disappear. Quietly, through thought, through perception, through the moments where something feels just beyond definition. And when those moments come, just like before, everything feels slightly different. And that difference is enough to remind you that not everything can be contained, not everything can be controlled, and not everything can be fully understood. And even now, after everything has been carried into that quiet awareness, there is still something that continues. Because what unfolded in that house in Alabama did not end with those who lived through it. It moved forward, not as a clear story, not as something written or recorded, but as a trace, a subtle imprint left behind in how things were understood, because moments like that do not disappear. They settle into perception, into the way people recognize that not everything follows the rules it is supposed to follow, that systems, no matter how controlled, are not complete. And once that is understood, it cannot be forgotten. The details may fade, the names may disappear, but the awareness remains. A quiet reminder that something once happened that changed how everything was seen. And that change continues, not loudly, not visibly, but persistently, only something to carry with you. That not all truths are meant to be fully revealed. Some exist in the space between knowing and not knowing. And that space has its own kind of power, because it cannot be controlled, it cannot be reduced, it cannot be undone. Not in the past, but in that awareness, a quiet, endless awareness that continues, through time, through thought, through every moment where something feels just slightly beyond understanding. And when those moments come, just like before, everything feels different. And that difference is enough to remind you. And even now, beyond everything that has been said, there is still something that does not fade. Because what took place in that house in Alabama was never only a moment. It became a marker, a point where something shifted, quietly, but permanently. Not in structure, not in appearance, but in understanding. Because once a moment reveals that control is not absolute, it changes how everything else is seen. Even if nothing else appears to change, that is what remained. Not the details, not the event itself, but the realization. A quiet realization that something existed beyond what was expected. And that realization moved forward, through memory, through silence, through the way people began to recognize that not everything could be predicted or contained. The sisters lived on within that awareness, not defined by it alone, but never separate from it. Because once something becomes part of how you understand the world, it does not leave. It becomes part of every decision, every thought, every moment where something feels just slightly different. The household carried it too, not openly, not in conversation, but in behavior, in the subtle ways people adjusted without needing to explain why. Because explanation was no longer necessary. Understanding had already taken its place. Only something to recognize, that not all change is visible, not all shifts are loud. Some happen quietly, deeply, in ways that cannot be undone. And once they happen, they remain. That is where this story truly rests, not in the past, alone, but in that shift, a quiet, lasting shift that continues, through time, through awareness, through every moment where certainty no longer feels complete. And when that feeling comes, just like before, everything feels slightly different. And that difference is enough to remind you that even the most controlled systems are not beyond change.